For centuries, the world has been taught a version of history that excluded Africa's greatness and her contributions and impact on today's civilization. A version of history where Africa appears only in the margins, only in slavery, only in poverty, only in crisis. But what if the greatest historical deception was not what humanity was told, but what humanity was never taught, truth hidden in plain sight? Long before colonialism, long before the transatlantic slave trade, long before Europe rose into global dominance, Africa was already shaping the intellectual, economic, and scientific foundations of the world. While parts of medieval Europe struggled through instability after the collapse of Rome, African civilizations were building centers of scholarship, trade, architecture, governance, and advanced knowledge. And one of the greatest examples stood at the edge of the Sahara Desert. Not a myth, not folklore, a real intellectual capital of the ancient world. At the center of Timbuktu stood Sankora University, one of history's great institutions of learning. Students traveled across continents to study there. Law, astronomy, medicine, mathematics, philosophy, theology, geography. Entire libraries filled with manuscripts existed in West Africa, while many parts of Europe were still emerging from intellectual decline and dealing with infestation and non-existent bathing practices. Think about the significance of that. African scholars were documenting scientific observations, debating legal systems, studying celestial movement, and preserving knowledge centuries before the modern world would acknowledge African intelligence. Because the issue was never that Africa lacked civilization. The issue was that the world later chose to erase African civilization from mainstream historical consciousness. At its height, Timbuktu contained hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, texts discussing astronomy, advanced mathematics, medicine, ethics, governance, knowledge that survived wars, invasions, colonialism, and deliberate destruction. And yet, many people today have never even heard of these manuscripts. Why? Because memory is power, and controlling the mind, specifically your mind's ability to remember, is one of the oldest forms of domination. Another African brilliance was Mansa Musa, who was one of the most powerful rulers in human history. A man so wealthy that historians still struggle to calculate the scale of his fortune in modern terms. His empire controlled massive portions of the global gold supply at a time when gold shaped international economies. When Mansa Musa traveled through Cairo during his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, historical accounts say he distributed so much gold that local economies experienced inflation for years afterward. Imagine possessing so much wealth that your generosity alters regional financial systems. But his greatest contribution was not gold. It was intellectual investment. He financed schools, libraries, scholarship, architecture, centers of learning. He understood something many societies still fail to understand today. A civilization becomes immortal when it preserves knowledge. And while West Africa expanded intellectually and economically, another African civilization rose in the south, Great Zimbabwe. Massive stone structures built without mortar, no modern cranes, no European engineers, no imported architecture, just African engineering brilliance. The walls still stand centuries later. Perfectly balanced stone construction demonstrating advanced understanding of structural design and urban planning. But when colonial historians first encountered Great Zimbabwe, many refused to believe Africans built it. Some claimed Arabs built it, others claimed Phoenicians, anyone except Africans, because admitting the truth would destroy the colonial myth that Africa lacked sophistication. But archaeology eventually forced the world to confront reality. Great Zimbabwe was African, designed by African minds, built by African labor, sustained by African systems of trade and governance. And then history entered one of its darkest chapters. The transatlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans violently removed from their societies. Not immigrants, not voluntary travelers. Human beings extracted from civilizations. The Atlantic world was not built solely on African labor. It was built on African expertise. Rice cultivation systems in the Americas relied heavily on agricultural techniques brought from West Africa. And what is rarely discussed is this: the people taken from Africa were not empty-handed. They carried knowledge. Engineering skills transferred through enslaved populations helped build economies across entire continents. Even inside systems designed to suppress Black intelligence, African brilliance such as Lewis Latimer continued to emerge, which may be one of the greatest demonstrations of human resilience ever witnessed. Many people know the story of the light bulb. Few know the story of the man who helped make it practical for the modern world. Early light bulbs burned out too quickly for large-scale use. Latimer developed the carbon filament process that dramatically improved durability and affordability. His work helped transform electricity from a laboratory experiment into a global infrastructure system. Cities illuminated, industries expanded, modern nightlife emerged. Civilization itself became electrified. And beneath that transformation stood an African-American inventor whose name history rarely places at the center of the story. Another one was Benjamin Banneker, a self-taught mathematician, astronomer, and surveyor. A man who built one of America's earliest clocks almost entirely from wood. A man who calculated astronomical cycles with extraordinary precision. A man who helped survey the land that became Washington, D.C. At a time when Black humanity itself was being questioned, Banneker demonstrated intellectual mastery that directly contradicted the racial ideologies of the age. And perhaps that is why his story was minimized, because excellence destroys propaganda. More so, Granville T. Woods was another African brilliance, an inventor whose innovations revolutionized railway communication systems and electrical engineering. His work improved transportation safety, communication efficiency, and industrial coordination during a period of massive technological expansion. Civilization accelerated, railways became safer, electrical systems became smarter, communication became faster, and again, African-descended brilliance sat beneath the machinery of modern modernity itself, often invisible, but foundational. And this is where the deeper conversation begins. Because the greatest tragedy is not simply that African contributions existed. The greatest tragedy is how systematically those contributions were erased. Entire educational systems taught generations of people that civilization moved in only one direction. From Europe outward, African states were ignored, African scholars minimized, African innovation erased, because controlling historical narrative creates psychological power. If a people are taught that their ancestors achieved nothing, eventually they may begin doubting what they themselves can achieve. This is not accidental. This is narrative engineering. But history has a strange property. Buried truth eventually resurfaces. And African brilliance did not end in the ancient or colonial world. It continued shaping the modern age. Philip Emeagwali pioneered breakthroughs in parallel computing, systems that allow thousands of processors to solve problems simultaneously. Today, modern supercomputers, climate simulations, internet systems, and advanced computational infrastructures depend on these principles. In many ways, the digital world itself stands on intellectual foundations shaped by African innovation. Another one was Katherine Johnson, a mathematical genius whose calculations helped send humanity into space. Before astronauts trusted computers, they trusted her mathematics. Think about that carefully. A Black woman in segregated America became one of the intellectual architects of human space exploration. Her calculations helped carry humanity beyond Earth itself. More so, we had Marie Van Britten Brown, inventor of the modern home security system, remote surveillance, camera monitoring, emergency alert systems. Technologies now embedded into millions of homes worldwide. Innovation born not from privilege, but necessity. And perhaps that is one of the most important truths in history. Some of humanity's greatest innovations emerge from people forced to survive systems designed against them. Which brings us to the deeper truth. Africa was never behind. Africa was interrupted. Africa was exploited. Africa was rewritten. But Africa was never absent from civilization. Humanity itself begins in Africa. Some of the earliest scientific thought emerged in Africa. Ancient trade systems flourished in Africa. Universities existed in Africa long before many modern nations existed anywhere on Earth. The issue was never lack of intelligence. The issue was narrative control. And when societies repeatedly show only images of African suffering, conflict, dependency, and poverty, something dangerous happens psychologically. People begin associating African identity with limitation. But identity shapes imagination, and imagination shapes destiny. That is why historical restoration matters, not to create superiority, not to replace one form of propaganda with another, but to restore balance. Because people who understand the greatness within their history begin to see greatness within themselves. To know your origins is not extremism, it is intellectual grounding. A tree disconnected from its roots eventually dies, and a civilization disconnected from its memory becomes vulnerable to manipulation. Africa is not a footnote in world history. Africa is one of the central foundations of world history. A source, a beginning, a force, and buried truth always rises. So the next time someone asks where civilization came from, remember this: before the world called Africa poor, the world went to Africa for gold. Before the world called Africa uneducated, the world traveled to Africa for knowledge. Before the world called Africa backward, Africa was already building civilizations that reshaped humanity. The story was never missing. The story was hidden, until now. If this video changed the way you see history, subscribe, share this message, and help reclaim the stories the world tried to bury. Because when people rediscover their history, they rediscover their power, tried to bury. Because when people rediscover their history, they rediscover their power.